Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our webcast with our founder and president, Helga Zepp LaRouche. Today is July 7th. We're coming off a week of extraordinary activity that seems to be continuing, and we're also watching as the British naturally are moving for a destabilization. Helga, why don't we start with this fairly extraordinary report in the Daily Mail of the cable traffic from the British ambassador in Washington back to the Foreign Office, deriding and derisively attacking the Trump administration. What do you make of that?
Well, we have to see, because the big question actually is who leaked this thing which can hurt and will hurt in all likelihood the so-called special relationship between the United States and Great Britain. Now, this is a fairly incredible story where the British ambassador in Washington, Sir Kim Darroch, basically sent way back to in 2017 and later cables to the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, basically describing Trump as incapable, inept, deriding him in all kinds of ways, but also, basically, having some real leaks of what, the British idea is. For example, they say that this ambassador says that he doesn't believe the reason why Trump supposedly called off the military strike against Iran 10 minutes before, that he finds it quite incredible that it was because of 150 casualties. In any case, he says you can have a U-turn again in no time if there's another Iranian attack anywhere, and if one single American life is is a casualty, you could have another, basically a military attack. Now that sounds more like an announcement of a false flag operation. So I think this is quite incredible. The British Foreign Office immediately, tried to calm the situation down by saying, we expect our ambassadors to give candid reports. That doesn't mean we share the same view, but basically we have excellent relations with the White House and they will not be heard. Now that remains to be seen, because remember that Trump was completely aware of the role of the British in the Russia Gate, and also at the speech he gave at the 4th of July at the Lincoln Memorial, he very vividly recounted that after all, the American Revolution was made against the British Empire, and he quoted Washington, saying that what was at stake was the life of millions of unborn children. And then he started to read from the Declaration of Independence. So I think what is quite interesting in this whole thing is that in many areas in the world, the role of the British as a destabilizing factor is becoming known. So whatever the reason was for this leak, which we will try to find out and discuss maybe later this week, but I think this is really showing you the not so nice face of diplomacy. And Nigel Farage naturally immediately said this ambassador should resign. He was a globalist. He should never have been in this post. So let's see what the reaction is from the Trump administration. But I think it will bring back into memory the whole role of the British in Russiagate, and that is a useful thing.
And the British clearly have quite a bit to be concerned about. Following the Osaka summit, it looks as though what was set in motion, what you described last week as presidential diplomacy, is continuing. We see a lot coming from Putin, discussions between the U.S. and Russia. What do you know about these kinds of developments?
Well, remember that last week we basically said this was not a spontaneous visit between Trump and Kim Jong-un at the demilitarized zone. And that is now indeed confirmed. The Japanese news agency Asahi Shimbun reports that this was indeed carefully prepared, that Trump early June wrote a letter to Kim Jong-un proposing such a meeting, and then asking for a signal if such a policy would be welcomed. And then the answer of North Korea then was that in the letter of Trump, there were very interesting proposals. So that basically was the green light. And then when Trump made this tweet, I want to come and say hello, naturally within hours, this was then facilitated and this meeting took place. I must say this meeting was completely underreported in the West. I think that this was a groundbreaking historical meeting, which should have been in the headlines for many days, because it is the potential to get rid of one of the most dangerous hotspots in the world, and it opens up the policy perspectives for a completely different relations, involving the United States, Russia, China, and then as a derivative of that, solving all the crisis spots potentially of the world. So this was and is a major event, and I think that we should keep discussing it, because that potential clearly keeps working. But as it was predictable, you immediately had also an escalation of countermeasures and counter moves, which I think have to be seen as the big historic fight between the old paradigm and the new paradigm.
Well, on the follow-up to these various summits, one of the things that's taking place is the U.S. Representative Begin and the South Korean envoy are heading to Europe. This seems to be quite significant, isn't it?
Yes, I think that they obviously want to inform Europe, Brussels, and Berlin in particular about this new arrangement. And I'm quite optimistic that eventually even the last person on the European continent, or maybe not everybody, but the majority of the political responsibles, will understand that this is a historic chance. Now, very significant also in the aftermath of the meeting between Trump and Putin in Osaka, you have now the resumption of strategic discussions in Geneva, where from the Russian side it is Sergei Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, and from the U.S. side it's the Undersecretary of State Andrea Thompson. And Ryabkov said we should not only have such meetings in crisis times, but there should be a structured process of such discussions. So I think this is very valuable, because this was lacking the whole time, that you had these kinds of discussions between the United States and and Russia. And one can clearly see which politicians and which forces are following the lead of Trump and Putin, and which forces inside the United States and naturally Great Britain are trying their very best to derange, derail these incredible efforts. So I think this is a very important guideline how to judge the present strategic situation.
Also, as one of these flanks, President Putin was just in Rome for some important meetings.
Yes, I think this was also very important, because Putin met with Mattarella, the president, also with Conte, with the Pope, and especially in the meeting between Prime Minister Conte and Putin, they discussed a very important issue, namely how to stop the civil war and chaos in Libya. They are both calling for a political solution, which I think is very important, because you can see that this combination of Italy and and Russia are working towards a political, peaceful resolution of one of the most unsettled situations on the globe. And Putin did not miss the opportunity to remind people of who is responsible for the chaos in Libya. It was NATO and European aircrafts which bombed Libya at the time, leading to a complete loss of statehood, basically, of Libya, And now you have the official government in Libya and also General Haftar. And basically, Putin is not backing Haftar, which some people had implied, but they're calling for a solution through negotiation. And it should be obvious that the situation in Libya is one of the absolute key problems to be solved if you want to have any kind of human solution to the refugee crisis. And I think that Russia and Italy are there playing a very important role. It is important in this context that Michele Geraci, who is, after all, the architect of the Italian-China policy, met with Putin, and both Putin and Geraci gave various interviews. And Geraci mentioned that Europe will become less and less worth talking about, which I think, in light of what is going on with the wheelings and dealings around who should get what post, and that Italy plans to play a much more important role in the mediation between Europe and Eurasia, and that Europe will basically become part of Eurasia. And I think this is very important, because that means a hint that the only solution to the chaos in Europe you could have if the integration of the new Silk Road, the Eurasian Economic Union, and European countries, if they become one economic zone. And I think that is exactly the policy we have been seeing with this visit of Putin. And Geraci also announced that he is going to lead a large economic delegation from Italy to Russia in the near future. So you see all these forces trying to align in a new way, a new paradigm, to have dialogue and peaceful negotiations as solution to the problems, as compared to those who try to keep the geopolitical conflicts going at all cost. So I think that you will see the fight between these two paradigms becoming more obvious by the day.
And one other example, coming back to the Osaka meetings, was the U.S.-China agreement to restart talks. Apparently, Liu He will be speaking with his American counterparts, Mnuchin and Lighthizer. That seems to be potentially promising also, doesn't it?
Yes, I think that the devil will be in the detail as usual. But I think that after the meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump, there is now green light again to solve these problems. And I think the spirit of Osaka and spirit of Singapore, which was revived in this meeting between Trump and Kim, I think that is all creating an environment where that can be on a positive track.
And those who prefer the old geopolitical confrontation have been quite busy. A couple of developments in the last days. You had the British Royal Marines seizing an Iranian tanker. You have the escalation around Hong Kong. What do you think the British are up to on this?
Well, I think the seizure of this Iranian tanker was correctly described by the Russian Foreign Ministry as a provocation. The supposed pretext was that this tanker was bringing oil to Syria, which was not true. And naturally, you have a very dangerous escalation on the question of Iran. Now, remember that it was the United States which left first the agreement, the JCPOA with Iran. And naturally, then following the shooting down of the drone and the various other developments, now Iran announced that they will increase the enrichment from 3.6%, which was allowed under the old agreement, to 5%. And the spokesman of the Iranian government said this is needed for the Bushehr nuclear plant, and it is only for a peaceful nuclear development. Now, naturally, you have a complete freak out of the war party in the United States. Remember that the whole Iran policy was really the design of John Bolton, and it was President Trump who called this military strike against Iran off literally in the last 10 minutes. But you have now senators like Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and a third one writing a letter to President Trump saying, don't fall for the nuclear blackmail. So there is a drumbeat, against Iran. And naturally, Netanyahu immediately called on the Europeans to reimpose sanctions and, basically say this. The only reason why Iran is wanting to have this enrichment is because they want to build the nuclear bomb. As I said, the British ambassador saying it just needs one more Iranian attack and Trump could go back in the direction of, making a military strike against Iran. So we should be aware, we have seen false flag operations in the case of the so-called chemical weapons attack by the Syrian government, a story which was pushed by the White Helmets, which was a completely false flag operation, which, by the way, now is out in the open because there was a report pointing to that. But I didn't see much of this in the Western mainstream media. So, I think this is very, very dangerous, the Iran situation. Then, you know, uh, in the case of Hong Kong, I think this is actually very interesting because Hong Kong, which was seized by Great Britain as a result of the Opium Wars and given back in some intermediate some temporary arrangement to China. Then you had these riots, which were clearly color revolution attempt, which was characterized as such by the Chinese government. And then you had the British Foreign Minister Hunt going out of his way, attacking China for being responsible for the chaos. I mean, the protesters, so-called, they committed violent acts. They occupied the parliament. So I think it's very interesting that Global Times had a very, very big ridicule of the role of the British, saying that they think they are still in the 19th century, but the time of the Opium Wars is over. And that basically the British cannot be taken serious because they talk about the golden age of British-Chinese relationship one day, and then the next day they warn China of very serious consequences. So I think it's very useful, because the British had clearly tried to sneak their way into the Belt and Road Initiative, pretending that they were the first ones to join the AIIB, and they pretended the golden age of relations is now coming. But when they do their geopolitical destabilizations and their role is coming out in the open, I think this is actually very, very useful.
Well, and as you said before, it's absolutely clear that whether you're talking about Russiagate or these war provocations, all roads lead to London. Now, in that context, you mentioned this earlier, but I think it's pretty interesting what Donald Trump had to say on July 4th in this Washington event, which the media was trying to minimize or attack. But he did bring up this U.S.-British question, didn't he?
Yes, and I think it's the July 4th for the Americans is obviously a day where they think about what is the purpose of the United States. And it is an undeniable fact that, the true identity of the United States is to be a republic. It was the freedom and independence was won against the British Empire. And it is always extremely useful when Americans remind themselves of that, because then, only then, if the population is conscious of the history of the United States, can they, become aware that this agreement between the American establishment and the British Empire to rule the world on the basis of an unipolar conception using the British Empire as the model, that is something entirely un-American, and that is what Trump potentially represents. And he has proven many times that he has impulses, to absolutely deny this imperial cooperation. And therefore, coming back to the revelation of the really spying, I mean, one thing I forgot to mention, this British ambassador also said that it is known that Trump is using the evening hours to make phone calls, to all kinds of people to find out what their advice is and thinking. And he said we have to basically flood the scene to influence all of the talks he has, which basically is an uninhibited signal or revelation that the British are trying to spy on the United States and even control all the private or control the people with whom Trump is trying to speak in the evening hours. I mean, this is a big scandal, and it just shows you the absolute character of the special relationship, especially after Trump was elected and has been basically on a completely different course. So hopefully this will all come out, and I'm sure it will have an impact on the election campaign. Oh, they said don't take it for granted. The Trump administration may crash, but don't take it for granted. And they are terrified about Trump 2020 winning again. This was also the content of the report of the House of Lords, which they say the special relationship was already hurt with the first Trump administration, but it would not survive a second one. So this is becoming very, very interesting.
And in keeping with this discussion of the battle between the two paradigms, I think if you look at the July 4th speech, one of the signature moments of it was Trump talking about the U.S. returning to Mars. This kind of approach, which reflects the views of your husband toward the future versus the actual state of the economy. EIR is going to be putting out a special report this week, the bitter truth about the U.S. economic recovery. So we're looking at a need for a real recovery package, aren't we?
Well, people should, get this ugly truth about the U.S. recovery report, because it shows you in absolute stark terms the collapse of infrastructure, homelessness, the drug epidemic, all the different aspects, and why the real Achilles heel for Trump is his insistence that the economy is doing so great because of the height of the stock market. I think this is the single most dangerous element, because the crash is clearly coming, and the likelihood that it will occur before the 2020 election is I would say, rather absolutely high, and that could be the real problem for Trump. So what we will do with the Schiller Institute and our colleagues in the United States, we are already working on a new report which takes the collapse of the US economy as the starting point to say what kinds of changes must be immediately implemented to fulfill the promise by Trump to put Americans back on the moon by 2024 and put a flag on Mars. I mean, the only way how that can be done is you need the kind of crash program which was designed by my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, the 4 laws. You have to have Glass-Steagall, banking separation, national bank, a new credit system, a new Bretton Woods system, which now becomes potentially absolutely doable with the good relations which has been established in Osaka between Trump and Xi and Putin, because you need that kind of power combination to have that kind of reform. But then we need an absolute scientific crash program. If you want to have the next generations fit, you need a space CCC program. You need, a complete mass education of young people to be fit for the kind of scientific and technological breakthroughs which a space program requires. So on July 20th, there will be the 50 years anniversary of the Apollo program, and we will have also major events internationally by discussing not only what happened in the last 50 years and 50 years ago, but basically the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche, the next 50 years of the planet Earth, and what needs to be done and what kinds of changes in the thinking are required if this is supposed to accomplish. Now, we had a very fascinating discussion in the last couple of days in the context of the absolute urgent need to have the exoneration of my husband as the key to get the United States on the solid right track. The problem naturally is that my husband had the proud age of 96 years. And, obviously, many people of his generations have passed long before him who knew him very, very well and were absolute great collaborators in their times and in their countries. But many of the young people have never met him personally. So one of the most intriguing ways of how you can find out who is Lyndon LaRouche is that he wrote many of his programs for the future generations. For example, when he initiated this incredible movie, The Woman on Mars, which I think was in 1988, if I'm not mistaken, this was basically the idea that a young girl was born who would be on Mars sometimes, I think, in 2033 or in any case, many generations ahead. And when you tell young people that he produced this in the 80s, and this is a date which has not even happened, or likewise, when he wrote the next 50 years of the planet Earth, this goes until 2055. So, for young people, it is especially intriguing that unlike the present crop of most politicians, that Lyndon LaRouche was a man who did think and care for future generations. And, I want to invite people to look at these, The Woman on Mars, the next 50 years of the planet Earth, and understand, why these kinds of ideas are so absolutely crucial for the solution of the problems today. So I would urge you again, please watch these videos, the video about the memorial of my husband and the video what happened in the prosecution, the case of Lyndon LaRouche, and look at these two videos, and then you will understand what is wrong and what has been wrong with the United States and what needs to be remedied if there should be a secure new paradigm for the whole world. And then spread these videos, sign the petition, help us to make these ideas more known. And that is the single most important thing you can do to contribute to the outcome of this moment of history.
I think for those of our viewers who have known Mr. LaRouche for some time, who are still around, it's time now to make it your personal mission to achieve his exoneration for the reasons that Helga just explained. So, Helga, is there anything else you wanted to bring up?
No, I think we are in a absolutely fascinating moment of history, which can be influenced by the action of each individual and all of you and all of us.
Okay, well, till next week, we'll see you soon.
Next week.